Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this lesson, we are going to learn about the most popular Node.js framework, which is Express.js. Now, Express is an awesome framework that allows you to build your Node.js applications using the features such as creating route handlers for your HTTP requests and even creating your own API endpoints. So what we're going to do in this lesson is create a weather application that communicates with an external API and then displays the weather data onto the screen. So here, if I type in Manchester, press go, we can see that we get the weather information back. Okay, so now on surface, it looks like a very basic project, and to be honest, it is. But this lesson is not so much about creating this application. It's more about structuring your Node applications in a way that the code we write is super organized and scalable. So for this project, you are expected to have a good knowledge of JavaScript and Node. If you are new to Node, then I do have a Node.js for beginners video on my channel, so go check that out. Okay, so without any further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so we're gonna get started right away and get our hands dirty by writing some Express code. So to do that, we're going to need a folder. So go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to create one on my desktop and I'm going to call it express-weather. Perfect. So first things first, let's launch this project into our terminal and type npm init. Okay, here we go. So npm init. This command is going to open up the Node.js environment for us where we can write Node code and install the packages using npm. So go ahead and press enter a few times, and once you've done that, type this command with me. npm install express. Okay, this is going to ensure that we have Express.js installed and ready to use. Okay, so next up what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this project into my code editor. There we go. Okay, inside of it, I'm going to create a new folder, call it src, and inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it app.js. Inside of it, just to make sure that everything is working, let's just console log hello. Press save. And now, let's head back to our terminal just to make sure that everything is working. So I'm going to clear up my terminal and type node src/app.js. Okay, so this command is going to launch this app.js file, and if you see this hello message, that means you have successfully set up your project. Now, let's move on to the fun part where we are going to write some Express code. So let's go back to our code editor. And now let's first open our package.json file and make sure that we have the Express package installed. And yes, we do. Now back in our app.js file, I'm going to get rid of this console log. And first, let's import the Express package that we have just installed. So I'm going to create a new constant and I'm going to call it Express and I'm going to set it to require. And then require the package, so Express. Perfect. So now let's first lay out a basic structure of what we are trying to achieve. So here's what we want to do. We want to use Express to display a web page in our web browser that reads some sort of a message. So type this with me. Const app equals Express. Okay, now let's create a route handler. So to do that, type app.get and open up a pair of parentheses, and the first argument is the route that we want to work with. So inside of these quotes, I'm going to pass this as a /, and then in the second argument, I'm going to pass a callback function, and this callback function takes two arguments. The first is rec, which is short for request, and the second is res, which is short for response. Inside of this callback, let's type res.send within the quotes my first Express web page. Okay, now the last thing that we need to do in this file is create a server that can actually listen to these HTTP requests. To do that, just type app.listen and then 3000. Okay, so confusing stuff here, but don't worry, let's break it down line by line. So the first line here imports the Express package that we installed using npm. And the second line initializes our Express application. So to initialize our Express app, we have created a new constant and we have set its value to this Express constant. And these parentheses right next to it mean that the Express project is now ready to use in this file. Okay, so now this app constant whose value is set to the Express function has a bunch of properties and methods that we can use in this file. And one of those properties is this get function. So app.get creates a route handler to listen for the get requests that we get from a client. So the first argument here in this function is the URL of the route that we want to make the get request to. So in this case, we are listening for get requests on our homepage or simply the localhost 3000. So there are a bunch of HTTP requests that you can use, and we're going to explore a couple more in this lesson. But this lesson is not about web requests, so if you do want to learn more about HTTP requests, I will link an article in the video description. Okay, so now the second argument is a callback function, and it takes a request object and a response object. The request object contains information about the request that comes back from the client, which we will talk about more later on. And the response object contains data that we want to send back as a response to the client once they've made the request. So the response object also contains a few functions, and one of those functions is this res.send function that allows us to send back this string of text that we've written here. Now, later on in this lesson, we will learn how to send proper web pages instead of just this plain text, but this is the meat and potatoes of setting up your own routes in Express. So you can also create multiple routes in just one file. So let's say that you have an online business and you want to set up a route handler that describes what your business is all about. So to create this new handler, just type app.get. And now the URL that we want to make the request to is /about. And then setting up our callback function, and let's pass it the two arguments that we need. So request and then response. Okay, and inside of it, let's send a response. So response.send. And for now, let's just send a string of text. So we can say something like, my business is so cool. Okay, right. So before we check our progress in the web browser, there is one last thing that we need to cover, and that is this app.listen line. So this app.listen function tells the server to start listening for connections on a particular port on your computer. There are a bunch of ports that you can pick from, but one of the more common ports is the port 3000. So we can also give this function a callback that gives us some kind of response once the server is set up successfully. So let's create an arrow function inside of here and pass this as the second argument. And inside of this function, let's console log something like the server is now running on port 3000. Perfect. So now if we head back to our terminal and type node src/app.js, we can see our little message appearing here. The server is now running on port 3000. But now the terminal is sort of just resting there after this message. And this is because the server is now live on our local host, and it is going to stay up and running as long as we do not terminate this process in our terminal. So now if we head back to our web browser and go to the localhost 3000, we can see that response that is coming back from the base URL. And now if we go to the about URL, we can see that response is coming back from the about URL. Okay, so this is the ins and outs of creating a route handler in Express. So now that we've covered that, let's have a little more fun with these routes. So now, instead of sending back these static messages, let's try to send back an actual page. So by an actual page, I mean a HTML template. But we're not going to spend time typing the HTML template because this lesson is not about HTML. I am creating this lesson assuming that you are already familiar with the basics of web development such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So to grab the HTML structure, go back to your web browser and go to this link. So it's github.com/Hamza Mirza/express-starter. This link will take you to my profile on GitHub where I've created this repository that contains the HTML structure that we need. So go ahead and crack open this express-tutorial folder, and inside of it there are two files, index.html and about.html. Now you can either download this entire repository or you can just crack open one of these files and then click on this raw button right here. This will give you the bare bones structure for our homepage. So if you press Command A on Mac or Control A on Windows, it's going to go ahead and select everything on this page, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy everything, go back to the VS Code, and then here within the root of our project I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it public. Inside of this folder I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it index.html and paste my clipboard right here. Perfect. And now I'm going to do the same with the about.html file. So go back to the express-starter folder and then crack open this about.html. Press raw and then select everything, copy, go back to VS Code and then create a new file, and I'm going to call it about.html and paste everything here. Press save. Okay. So now let's go ahead and open one of these files. So if I go back to my Finder and then inside of this public folder, I'm going to go ahead and launch this index.html file. Okay, so as you can see that this is just the bare bones plain HTML. All the styling has been provided by Bootstrap and it's the same in this about.html file as well. Okay. So now, as we said, we will not be covering HTML in this lesson, but if you want to understand what's going on in these files, just crack open one of these and have a look. Okay, so I'm going to close these two files. We will come back to these later on, and let's carry on working in our app.js file for now. Right, so instead of these strings of text, let's try to render these HTML templates when the user visits these URLs. So now you may be tempted to do something like, res.send and then go to the path of this index.html file. But no, this is not going to work because although it is intuitive, Express does not work like that. Express by default does not have access to any of your public files. So there are two ways we can do this. First, let me show you the quote-unquote bad way of rendering a file. So this is how you would have to display a file without using much of the functionality that Express provides. So first of all, I'm going to comment this block of code. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say app.get, and then the URL is going to be the same as the one that we commented up there. And then pass in the callback function and then give it the arguments that it needs. So request and response. Perfect. Inside of this function, let's create another function called res.send file. Okay. And this function takes two arguments. The first argument is the name of the file that you want to serve, and the second argument is the path of the file. So in this case, the name of the file is index.html, and make sure you write this within the quote. So index.html, remember this is the first argument, And the second argument is the path. So let's open up an object, okay, and then create a property called root. And now we need to use a built-in Node module called path. So first of all, right here at the top, let's create a new constant and call it path, and then import the path module from Node.js. Okay. Now, something I like to do is place my native Node modules right at the top of the file. Now you see, the Express package is a third-party module. It does not come built in Node.js. So, but path is actually a built-in Node.js module. Now, 9 out of 10 times, the native modules are never going to be dependent on third-party modules. It's always going to be the other way around. Okay, now in this particular case, the Express package does not rely on the path package. But just to be on the safe side, it is a good practice to always have your native modules before your third-party modules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this line out and paste it right here. Perfect. Okay, and now that we've got this path module in place, in here, what we can say is path, and then there's a method in this package called join. Okay, and this method takes two arguments. The first one is a built-in Node.js path argument called __dir name, and the second argument is a folder where our target files live. So in this case, the folder's path is, and make sure you type this within the quotes, //public. Okay, that's all we need for now. Okay, so now if we press save, head back to our web browser, and let me just terminate this process. Node src /app.js. And now if I refresh my page, we can see that we do indeed get the index.html file that we put into our public folder. And this is perfect. Now let's do the same for our about route. So for now, I'm going to comment out this route handler right there. Okay. And then create a new get request. So app.get, and then set it to /about, and then open up the callback function, and inside of it, let's do request and response. Perfect. And in here, let's copy what we have in this get request and paste it right here. So from this res all the way to this closing parentheses right here, press copy and paste it here. Now in this case, what we want to show is display the about instead of the index. So I'm just going to change this to about. Okay, perfect. Now if I press save, go back to the terminal, and let me just relaunch the process. So node src /app.js, and this is the home URL. Now if I go to the about URL, press enter, we do get the about.html file that we put into our public folder. Okay, so as I said before, this is not how we want to structure our app. I mean, imagine if you had like 60 different routes. Would you write this code for every single route? No, you wouldn't. So let's get rid of these two requests, okay, because we're not going to use them, and uncomment out this code that we commented out first. Okay, press save, go back to the terminal, relaunch the entire process, and then node src /app.js. Let's refresh our about, and we get our original route. And if we go back to our home page, we get our original home page text. Perfect. So now is a good time to use something called Express middleware. Now, what is middleware? So in short, middlewares are functions that get executed during an incoming request, meaning we can use these middleware functions to provide supplemental data for our requests. So let's say that you are making a get request to this home URL. So now during this whole process, you want the request to have access to these files. So in order to make that happen, you can use middleware functions. Now let me tell you, you don't need to memorize any of these middleware functions that we are about to create, because in most cases, Most of these just act as the basic Express configuration, and you will find them in pretty much every single Node and Express project. So let's get started. These middleware functions are actually methods that live inside of this app object. So the first one is app.use, and then it's express.url encoded, and then open up a pair of parentheses inside of that an object and set the extended property to false. Okay. This function is essential for your basic project configuration. The next function is app.use, and it's express.json. Okay. This function is going to convert or parse any incoming JSON data. Again, these are just part of the configuration and there is no need to memorize any of these. Okay, next is app.use, and then it's express.static, and this is a method, and inside of it we pass in the argument called public. Okay. This function is telling Express to gain access to everything that's inside of this public folder. That means you do not need to declare the path to this file manually in your requests like you did previously. Okay, and the next one is app.set, and then the first argument is views. The second argument is also views. Now this function contains something called views. We haven't talked about views yet, but in essence, views are the files that you render in the web browser. So essentially, this index.html and the about.html are views, but they cannot be considered as views. Why? It's due to this HTML extension in the end. So for them to be considered as views, we need to install a view engine. Now, there are a bunch of view engines out there. The one that I like to use is called Handlebars or HBS. So to install it, let's go back to our terminal, kill the current process, okay, and then type npm install HBS. Press enter. Okay, now that it's been installed, let's go back to our app.js file, and then there is one last piece of puzzle that we need to complete, and that is to tell Express to use this Handlebars Express engine that we have just installed. Okay, so to do that, type app.set, and then the first argument is the view engine within the quotes, and the second argument is the view engine that we actually want to use, and that in this case is HBS. Perfect. And with this line, our configuration is now complete. Again, if these lines don't make 100% sense to you, don't worry. If you continue to build more and more Express applications, you will use them so often that they will become second nature. Okay, so now that's out the way, let's move on. So now let's actually try to render these pages onto the web browser using a proper way of rendering the files. But to do that, we need to make a couple of changes. Since we are using the templating engine that is Handlebars, we need to convert these HTML files to the files that the Handlebars can read. For that, all we need to do is change this HTML extension to HBS. So I'm going to change this to HBS, and the same with this one as well. Okay, perfect. Now if we crack open one of these files, we can see that the syntax highlighting is the same as you would find in a HTML file. The only difference is that we can now serve these files in our JavaScript files, and we can also do some cool new things that we will cover later on in this lesson. Okay. And there is no need to import these files in our main app.js file, because if you remember, we did set a middleware function right there that gives Express access to the files in our public folder. Okay, but there is one small tweak that we need to make before we do anything else. So see this line of code that reads app.setViews and then views. This line is telling Express to look for these views in a specific directory which is called views. We can change this to public if we want, but the general convention is to create a folder called views and put your views in there. So now let's go ahead and create a new folder in the root of our project and call it views. Okay, so new folder and then views, and now all we need to do is copy these two files and then paste them inside of this views folder. Okay, excellent. So now we don't actually need them in the public folder, so we can actually get rid of them. So I'm going to delete the about file, and I'm also going to delete the index file. Okay, but just for the sake of this project structure, I'm going to leave this public folder there as it is. Right, so now let's actually use Express to display these files in the web browser. To do that, all we need to do is make changes to this res.send method. So Express provides us with another method called render. And this render method does exactly what it says. It renders a file that gets passed in as an argument. So to achieve that, all we need to do is convert these two methods to render. Okay, and then instead of this static text, we need to replace that with the name of the file that we want to show in the web browser. Okay, so I'm going to change this to render. And then I'm going to get rid of this string of text, and I'm going to say that when the user visits this URL, display the index file. And now same thing here, I'm going to change this to render, get rid of the string, and then we can say that when user visits this about URL, show them the about page. Excellent. Press save, head back to the terminal, and I'm going to terminate the current process. Say clear and node src/app.js. And now if I visit the localhost 3000, we can see that we are actually getting this index.hbs when we visit the home URL. And then if we go to about, we do get the about.hbs file in our web browser. And this is perfect. And in case you are wondering why we did not include the HBS extension or why we didn't include the path of the file, this is because we've already told Express in these middleware functions that we are going to use a templating engine whose extension is HBS. And then in this middleware function, we've told Express to look inside of this views directory whenever we want to render a view. Okay? Now we can do a bunch of things in our handlebar views. We can also render data that we pass inside of our get requests. So check this out. Here inside of this get request, I'm going to pass in another argument, and that is going to be an object. Okay? Inside of this object, let's create a new property and call it title. And I'm going to set it equal to weather finder. There we go. Okay. Now, because this object is part of this request, that means it's tied to this URL. And we can actually access this object inside of the view that it's tied to. In this case, the view is index.hbs. So back in this index file, let's find the title of this project. And where is it? Here it is, right here. Now to insert the title that we declared in our app.js file, all we need to do is add 2 pairs of curly braces. So I'm going to cut this out, okay, and then open up 2 pairs of curly braces and then close it with another pair of closing curly braces. Okay, if you have used React, this syntax may look very familiar to you. So now all we need to do is throw in the name of the property that we've declared in our get request. And the name of the property is title. Excellent. Now let's press save, head back to the terminal and restart the process. So clear and then node src/app.js. And if I refresh the page, we can see that everything is working as expected. And just to prove that we are actually receiving this title from our route handler, let's change this to Express Weather Finder. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my terminal, kill the current process, and I'm going to restart it. And if I refresh my page, we can see that we get Express weather finders. Okay, and this is perfect. Okay, so now we've covered the basics of Express and we know how to render files using a templating engine. So now it's time to change our gears and do something a bit more exciting. So in the next section of this lesson, we are going to learn and implement the MVC pattern. At this point, I don't expect you to know what the MVC pattern is, but just to give you a little overview, MVC stands for Model View Controller. And following this MVC pattern is the industry standard of creating robust web applications. It is one of the most desirable skills that companies look for, and it allows you to keep your project super organized. I am very excited to jump into it, so let's keep our momentum rolling and dive right in. Okay, welcome back. So before we actually implement the MVC pattern, let's make a small change to our project. Because this section is all about keeping your project organized, and for that reason we're going to make some changes to our app.js file. Okay, so we want our app.js file to just act as an entry point. That means we don't want anything other than our basic configuration and the call to the server in here, and not even these route handlers. So to do that, let's create a new file inside of this source folder that's going to be responsible for handling the routes. So here, let's create a new file and call it router.js. Excellent. Inside of this file, let's first import Express. So const Express and set it to equal require and then Express. Perfect. Now check this out. Express gives us access to its own built-in router, and its job is to handle the routes. Nothing more, nothing less. So to make use of this router, let's create a new constant, call it router, okay, and set it to equal express dot router, and then a pair of parentheses because it is a method. So you can think of this router as the mini app. Now we can use this router constant to set up our routes much like we did in our app.js file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut all these routes and then paste them in my router.js file. So I'm going to cut this to my clipboard. Okay, go back to the router.js file, and now I'm going to paste them here. So what we need to do now is replace this app with the router that we've just created up there. Okay, so there we go. Excellent. And then since we are using our app.js file as the entry point, we need to import this router in our app.js file. And for that, let's say module.export and set it to equal this router constant up there. Okay, press save. Now let's head back to our app.js file, and here we need to import the router file that we've just created. So const router and set it to equal require, and then it's ./router. Excellent. And now to make use of it, all we need to do is right here say app.use, and then we're going to use the base URL, which is the /, and the second argument is going to be the router constant that we just created up there. Okay, this line is going to ensure that all the routes get handled by the Express router, but they end up here in this app.js file because this is where our server lives, right there. So now to test our progress in the web browser, I'm going to go back to my terminal and I'm going to launch this file, and then here let's press enter and see what we get back. So we can see that everything is working just as expected, and this is perfect. Now let's talk about the V in MVC. We already know that the V stands for view, and now view is all the code that we display in the web browser. So that means that these two files, the index.hps and the about.hps, are actually views. So if you look at it this way, we've already been working with the v in MVC since we introduced our views. We just didn't know that. Now that it's out the way, let's talk about the C in MVC, which is controller. A controller is where we put all our logic, and it is also responsible for interacting with the views. So if you think about it, what file in our current project is interacting with the views? It's this router.js file, isn't it? Because that is where we are handling all our routes. Now the issue here is that the router file should handle the routes and routes only. That means whenever we visit a given URL, it's the job of the router file to tell the web browser to launch those routes. But what we are doing here is, in this file, we are declaring the routes, which is fine, but we're also interacting with the views. And that's not right, because that's the job of the controller. But the question is, how do we figure out what's a controller and how do we make it interact with our views? Well, let's create a new folder inside of our source folder and call it controllers. Excellent. Now inside of this folder, let's create a new file and call it controller.js. Perfect. Now this is where we are going to put all our logic that's going to power our web app. So the first thing is, let's use this controller to interact with our views. And doing that is as simple as creating a new route handler, just like we did in our app.js and router.js files. However, structuring this file is not very simple, because you see, we want to create some functions here that are going to handle the routes. So instead of getting into creating separate functions, exporting them individually, and then risking messing up our code, we can just create named exports that we can then use in our router file. So check this out. We can start with the keyword exports. Okay, this is going to make sure that the function is ready to be exported right from the get-go. So exports, and let's call this function render home page, and then set it to equal an arrow function, and then inside of it, let's pass in, come on, can I just type in an arrow function, please? Yeah, there we go. And inside of it, let's pass our request and response arguments. Now inside of this function, we can just say res.render, and then we want to render the index view. Okay. Now let's go ahead and do the same for the about route. So I'm actually going to copy this and paste it here, and I'm going to change this to about, and I'm going to change the name of the view to about as well. Okay, press save. Now back in our router file, we need to import this file that we've just created. So right here at the top, let's say const and call it controller. Okay, and then set it to equal require, and then we need to jump up one directory. No, it's actually within the same folder. So we need to go to controllers and then select this controller file. Now I'm going to select everything from the start of this callback function all the way before the closing parentheses of this get request, and I'm going to delete it. So from there all the way till there. And now we can access the render homepage method that lives in this controller file that we have just exported. So we can say controller dot, and then we can see that in the suggestions we've got the render homepage there already. Okay, now let's go ahead and do the same with our about route. So I'm going to get rid of my callback function, and I'm going to say controller dot render about page. Excellent. Press save, and now there's one more thing we need to do. So back in this index.hps file, we need to get rid of this little constant, because there is no title in our object anymore. So if we just go back to our controller, you can see that there's literally just this index page. We're not actually creating a new object and declaring the title property. So let's just replace that with weather finder. Okay, We will make further use of these objects that we can declare inside of our routes, but there was no point in just rendering out some static text. So now let's head back to the terminal and then restart this process. So node src app.js. And now if I visit this URL again, we can see the change that we just made, and then we can visit the about URL as well, and we can see that we're also getting the contents of the about page. Perfect. Now I realize that this part might be a bit frustrating for you. You might be thinking, why do we need to create all these separate files and split our code like this? But trust me when I say this, implementing these industry standard practices, it's what's going to set you apart from other developers. I know this is not a very comfortable approach, but trust me, you never grow in your comfort zone. You know, stepping out of your comfort zone is the best way to grow as a developer or in any other aspect of your life. So if you were able to follow along, congratulations, you now have taken your skills one step further. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this section, so let's review what we have done so far. So first up, in our app.js file, we are kickstarting everything by setting up some basic configuration. Again, if these lines are confusing, don't worry, we will cover these as we continue to use them. After that, we have imported the router.js file right here, and then right at the end, we have the call to our local server. Now, inside of our router.js file, we have set up the routes using something called Express router. This Express router is the same as the app object that we have here in our app.js file, except the only job of the router is to create routes, nothing else. Now these routes are actually being managed by our controller. So in this controller.js file, we have the named exports, which are functions, and these functions are essentially the callback function that actually take place in our route handlers. The only reason we have a separate file for managing these routes is because these routes are part of setting up our logic. A bit later in this lesson, we will be making API calls, handling errors and whatnot, and we don't want to clutter our router.js file with all that logic. Handling the routes is the responsibility of the controller, and it also interacts with the views, and here you can see we are rendering the views that live inside of our views folder. So we've covered the V and the C in the MVC pattern so far. What's left now is the M, which is the model. We will cover that later when we actually start creating our weather app. And guess what? That is actually what we're going to do in the next section. So hang tight and I'll see you then. Alright, so now that we've covered the basics of Express and we have a good understanding of how it works with the routes and the views to actually build a web page, let's go ahead and create a project to solidify our understanding. So we have everything in order to get started. We have the views that contain the templates that we're going to render, and we have a good project structure in place. So let's jump in. So obviously with the weather app, we are going to need a form and an input fields to enter the name of the city. And that form lives inside of our index.hbs file. So crack open that one and scroll down to the form. And in this form, let's give it an action. And that is a built-in HTML attribute. And set it to equal / or the base URL. And let's also give it a method, okay? And set it to equal post. Perfect. These attributes are going to allow us to send off our request to the Weather API service whenever we press this go button right there. Next, let's give this input fields a new attribute called name and set it to equal city. So name and then city. This will allow us to read the value of whatever the user types in this input fields, okay? And here, I don't even know why I typed -0 degrees. There is no such thing as a -0. I would make a terrible weatherman. Anyway, let's continue. Right, so now let's actually try and see if this form works. To do that, we need to make a new type of request to our base URL, and this type of request is called a post request. We make a post request when we are sending off the data to the server. So in a GET request, what we do is we are requesting the data, we enter the URL, and then we wait for the server to send us the data back. In a post request, however, we send the server our own data to work with. So for example, whenever you sign up or log into a website, you are making a post request, and that request sends your credentials that you type in to the web server, and then that web server interacts with the database and see if your credentials match the ones that live in the database. So let's crack open our router.js file, because that is where we are handling the routes. This time we're gonna create a new route, but this one's gonna be a post request, okay? So just below this router.get request, we're gonna say router.post, and then the URL that we need to make the post request to is this base URL, so just the /. And if our form and input lived somewhere else, for example, if they lived in this about.hbs file, then we would have to make the post request to this /about routes. Okay, so now that we have our route in place, let's place our callback function and call it controller.getWeather. Excellent. Now to actually create this function, we need to open up our controller, okay? And just below this render home function, let's create a new named export and call it exports.getWeather, and then set it to equal an arrow function. And then inside of it, first of all, let's place in our arguments, so request and response. Now right here, for the time being, let's just say res.send, and then a string of text that reads your form has been submitted. Excellent. Now let's press save and then go back to the terminal and fire off our app.js file. So node src /app.js. And now let's go to our localhost. Okay. And now let's go ahead and press this button and see what happens. So when we press this, we get the message that reads your form has been submitted. Perfect. So next up, we need to see if we are actually able to access whatever the user types in this input fields. You see this input right there. So in this case, it's going to be the name of the city. So we need to see if we have set this up correctly. Now the question is, where does this value get stored? I mean, we know that in a regular JavaScript file, we can access the value of the input using the name.value property. But in this case, we are working with Express. So Express stores all of the data that we sent in this other argument that we haven't talked about yet, and it's this request argument. This request argument is actually an object, so let's console log this request property as soon as we make the post request. So right here, just say console.log and then request. Press save. Now let's head back to the terminal. Okay, terminate the current process and say node src /app.js. Now let me refresh this page, and here I'm gonna type in Manchester. Okay, and now if I press go, and if you look back into the terminal, we can see that there's quite a bit of data. Okay, but let me tell you, 99.9% of this is irrelevant to us in this case. The only property that we are concerned with is this body property right there. As you can see that this body has an object, this one right there, and inside of it we have a property named city, which is actually the HTML name attribute that we gave to our input in the index.hbs file, and then its value is Manchester. So now to actually use this inside of our project, let's go back to our controller. Okay, and here let's get rid of this string once and for all. Now let's open up a pair of backticks to initiate a template literal, and here let's type you typed and then a $sign followed by a pair of curly braces. Now to access the value, we can say request.body, and then inside of that, the name of the property that we want to access is city. Okay, and then a full stop here. And let's get rid of this console. Perfect. So now let's go back to the terminal again, kill the current process, and then refresh the page. Right, so now let's type in Manchester again, press go, and let's take a look in the terminal. And there is, well, not in the terminal actually. We get the message that says you typed Manchester. And then if we type in something else, let's say we say Leeds, press go, we say you typed Leeds. So everything is working as expected. Alright, so now that we've got everything in place, we have all the routes set up and we're able to access the input data, let's actually go ahead and use the weather API service to fetch some weather. Now, if you have watched any of my previous videos, you know that I absolutely love the Open Weather Map. In my opinion, it's just super easy to work with and it's amazing for side projects as well as tutorials. So just go to this link, openweathermap.org/API. And if it asks you to sign up or sign in, you have to do that in order to obtain the API key. So go ahead and click on this sign in button. And in my case, I am already signed in. But once you've done that, then press this API key section. And this is where you can obtain the API key that you need. Now let's go back to VS Code. And right here at the top, let's create a new constant in all capitals called API_key and set it to equal a new string, and inside of it let's paste our API key. Excellent. Now let's go back to the web browser and go to this API section right here at the top. Now from here we want to access the current weather data, and it's actually the first one right here. So let's click on this API doc button. Now we need to find the link that we want to make the request to, okay? And the link is this first orange line that we see right there. So let's go ahead and click it, and here is all the data that we need. Right, so before we continue, let me just tell you that this lesson assumes you already know how to work with APIs. I will explain what we are doing as we go along, but if you are new to APIs, then you might want to check out a beginner-friendly API tutorial. I do have a couple of those on my channel, in plain JavaScript as well as in React and Node, so go check them out. Okay, so the property that we are interested in is this main property right there, because that is where the temperature property lives, and then to access it we'll have to type something like main.temp. But first of all, we need to find a way to make the API call, and the way is actually pretty simple. We are going to use a third-party library called Axios to make the request. So let's open up our terminal, kill the current process and type npm I Axios. Press enter. Excellent. Once it's been installed, let's head back to our package.json file just to make sure that it is actually there. There we go. So first things first, let's import this library in our controller. So back in our controller.js file, before our API key constant, let's create a new constant called Axios, and then require the package that we've just installed, and Axios. Perfect. Now here in this getWeather function, let's first get rid of this line because we don't need that. And now let's store the value of the city into a new constant. So let's say const city, and then set it to equal request.body.city. Now remember, this line means that we are accessing the property, the city property, from the body object that lives inside of this request argument right there. Okay. Now press save and then go back to our web browser, and now we need to copy the URL that we want to make the API request to, and it's this URL right there. So let's go ahead and copy it. Now let's go back to VS Code and create a new constant right there. Okay, so const, and let's call it URL, and then open up a template string. Now the reason we're using a template string and not a regular string is because we are going to append this API key constant right at the end of the URL. So let's open up a template string, okay, and paste the URL there. Now to actually append this API key, we need to say the $sign right at the end of this URL, and then type APPID and set it to equal a new object literal, just like that. And in here we can append the API key constant that we've declared up there. Okay, now press save. So now we are in a pretty good shape to actually make the API call, and for that we need to use the Axios library that we have just installed. So let's go ahead and use a method that comes with Axios, and it's called get. So the get method takes in the one and only argument, and it's the URL that we want to make the request to. So inside of our get weather function, let's say Axios.get, and then the URL that we need to make the request to is the constant up there. Perfect. Now, since Axios is a promise-based library, we need to resolve the promise and then catch any errors that may occur during the process. So right after this get method, let's create another method or append another method called then. And then another method called catch. So after that, let's append a new method called catch and close it with a pair of parentheses. So the then method takes one argument. It's actually a callback function. And then this callback function takes one argument itself. And this argument is going to store all the data that we get back from the API as an object. So you can call it whatever you like. I'm going to call it response. And for now, let's just go ahead and console log this response argument, okay? Now, we still need to work with this catchphrase. So this also takes one callback function. And then this callback function takes an argument called error. And for now, let's just go ahead and console log this error. Okay, press save. And now it's time to test things out. So let's go back to the terminal. Okay, and relaunch our app.js file. So node src /app.js. Now let's head back to our localhost, okay, and type in Manchester. Now, as soon as we press go, we should get the results from the API, and they should look pretty similar to what we have over here. So let's see if we can actually make this work. So press go, and what we have here is not very promising. You see, it's some sort of a warning. It's not exactly an error, but it's also not giving us the results that we're looking for. I mean, all we should get back is this whole object right there. But what we have here looks nothing like what we want it to look like. So what's going on? So the reason we're not getting the results we want has nothing to do with our code, and it's everything to do with this URL right there. You see, it just starts with this api.openweather. Now, there is nothing wrong with that, but I mean, it's a perfectly secure website. But Express and Axios don't know that. Axios and Express want to make sure that we are not making any web requests to any insecure websites. And that is why we are not getting the results that we want. So to fix this, we just need to make a small change to this URL. All we need to do is prefix this URL with http://. This prefix is going to assure Express and Axios that this is indeed a safe and secure URL. So now if we head back to the terminal, okay, and then restart the current process. Now let's go back to our web browser. And then pressing this go button is going to fire off the Axios get request. So let's press it. Now head back to our terminal. And it says that response is not defined. And why is that? Actually, this should be response. Sorry, my mistake. Now let's head back to the terminal and then restart the current process and then go back to our web browser. Press go. Now we should have the data that we need, and it is definitely there. So this is the whole object that we're going to be working with. So it lives inside of this data object, and then inside of this data object is this main object, and then it's going to be something like data.main.temp, and this is perfect. Now, I don't like that these temperatures, these values are being displayed in a imperial format. I mean, I'm British, I live in England, I'm used to seeing the metric format. Okay, so to fix that, we can go back to the code editor and we can make a change to this URL again. Now, OpenWeatherMap gives us the option to change the unit. So if we scroll right at the bottom, we can see that we do have an option right here. And here what we need to do is right at the end of the URL, we need to say units and set it equal to metric. Okay, so now if we head back to the code editor, and right at the end of our URL, after this API key constant, let's say another ampersand sign and say units and set it to equal metric. Press save. Now, obviously, if you live in the US or if you are somebody who is used to seeing the imperial system, feel free to leave it as it is. But I'm more comfortable with the metric system, so this is why I've done that. Okay, so now let's head back to the terminal just to make sure that everything is still working. And I'm going to terminate the current process, and I'm going to say node src app.js. Now let's go ahead and relaunch our local host. Press go. And now we can see that temperature is being shown in this metric format, and this is perfect. Now keep in mind that this is the temperature for London, and the reason for that is because we are making the call to the URL that has London right here. Now to fix this, we will have to replace this London city with our city constant that we declared right here. So to change that, let's actually cut this URL, okay, and paste it right here inside of our get weather function. Now to replace this London with our city, we already have a template string, so I'm going to get rid of this, okay, and I'm going to say $, curly braces, and then replace this with the city. Now whatever we type in our input field is going to act as a placeholder right here. So let's go back to our terminal, again restart the process, and then go back to the web browser and say Manchester and press go. And now we can see that the temperature is different, 12.14, but most importantly, the name of the city now is Manchester. And we can prove it that is actually working by, let's replace this with Leeds, press go, and now we're getting the weather for Leeds. So it's 7.25 and the name of the city is Leeds. So everything is working just as expected, thankfully. Okay, so now let's extract the properties that we need from the API. So let's open our terminal and see what we need. So I want to display a message that reads something like it's currently X degrees in X city. So for that, what we need from this API response is this temp property that lives inside of this main object, and then this name property that lives right there. So let's go back to VS Code, and then inside of this get weather function, let's console log our template string, and then inside of it, let's say, so I'm going to get rid of this response. So open up a pair of backticks, and then let's type it is currently, and then to access the temperature property, we can first open a template literal. So a $, followed by a pair of curly braces, and then it's response dot. And remember, this is where all the data is stored. And then we need to access the data object. So response.data, and then it's main, and inside of the main object, we have a temperature property. So response.data.main.temp. And then we can say that, so far it reads, it is currently X degrees, well, whatever temperature we get back in, and then we need to type in the name of the city. So $, a pair of curly braces, so then we can say response.data, and then its name, and then a full stop. Perfect. Now let's test our work in the web browser, well, in the terminal, because this is where we are logging our data. So let's go back to the terminal and then kill the current process, and then it's node src app.js. Now let's refresh in the web browser, and now here let's say Paris. Okay, so now if we press go, we should have our message, and it reads it is currently 6.89 in Paris. So this is absolutely amazing, because what we have done now is we have interacted our front end with our back end. So our front end being this view, and now we are using our front end to interact with the back end. So our back end being this console log right there. So it is working as expected so far. Let's carry on. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try to display this message in our views. So I'm going to kill this process in the web browser. And now what we need to do is back in our VS Code, we need to cut this line out because we will need it in just a little bit. Okay. And now let's use the res.render method to display the web page. So I'm going to get rid of this console log and now say res.render. And then let's render the index.hps page because this post request is taking place on our base URL, okay? So now the question is, how do we display that message on the screen? So if you remember, in the beginning of this lesson when we were learning about Express and templating engines, we learned that we can create our own objects inside of the route handlers. So let's pass in another argument right next to this index view, okay, and that's going to be an object. Inside of this object, let's create a new property called weather, and then we're going to set its value to the line that we just cut up there. Okay, perfect. Now to display this message in our view, let's crack open our index.hps file, and this is where we want to display the message. So currently it's just the static text, and let's get rid of that. And now I'm going to open up two pairs of curly braces, okay? Inside of it, we can throw in the weather property that we just declared, just like that. Now remember, this will only show up once we have pressed the go button, because by default, we are rendering this view in a GET request. But this weather property is now part of the post request, okay? So let's save this file, head back to the terminal, and I'm going to relaunch this process. So node src app.js. Let's refresh in the web browser and type Paris. Let's see what happens. And we get the message that reads, it is currently 6.71 in Paris. Let's try Manchester, and we get it's currently 10.05 in Manchester, which is a bit unusual because at this time of the year it's absolutely freezing. Okay, so we now have a semi-complete version of our app. We still have a long way to go before we actually complete this project, so let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, so in this section we are going to try and understand the M in MVC, which is the model. So let's just do a quick review of MVC. So far we've covered C and V. So as we know, V is the views, so this folder right there, and the views are fairly straightforward. So views are what we display in the web browser. After that, we covered C, which is the controller. Okay, so a controller's responsibility is to contain all the logic of our project, and it's also responsible for interacting with the views as well as the model. So you can say that the controller is like the middleman. Now finally, what is a model? So a model is responsible for containing all the rules and regulations that we want our application to follow. For example, we want to set a rule to this input in the web browser, okay, this one right there. So we want to set a rule to this input and the rule is that it cannot be empty. So if the user tries to submit an empty input, we cannot let them do that, all right? So hopefully you are starting to see the bigger picture here. The M is the model where we can set all the rules and essentially model our application data. The V is the view that we display in the web browser, and finally the C is the controller where we put all our logic, and it's also where we interact with our views as well as our data model. And all of this comes together in the end to make the MVC pattern. Okay, so all this sounds good in theory, but let's actually put it to practice. So let's get started by creating a new folder inside of our source folder, okay, and call it model. Excellent. And inside of it, let's create a new file called weather.js, and weather with a capital W. It doesn't make a difference whether the first letter is upper or lowercase. It's just a convention to name your model with a capital letter. Okay, so now inside of this model, let's create a blueprint or a constructor function called weather. Okay, so let's say const weather, and then let's create a new function. Okay, perfect. Now here, let's give it a new property by saying this dot data and set it equal to data. And now let's set a new argument here called data. Okay, because that is what is the data is going to be pointing towards. So this data right there is this placeholder right there in the argument. And I will come back to what this data actually means just in a little bit. First of all, let's fill out our weather model, okay? Now let's create a function that's going to check if the input is empty or not. And we could call the function something like validate user input and then set it up inside of this blueprint function. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But let me show you a cleaner way and a more scalable way to setting up new methods. So we can use JavaScript's prototypes to create new methods. Okay, so check this out. We can say weather dot the keyword prototype and then the name of the method we want to create. So in this case, it's called validate. Let's call it user input and then set it equal to a new function. Excellent. In here, let's say that if the data, so if this dot data is equal to an empty string, then what? How do we display an error message? So there are 1,000 ways you can accomplish this, but here is how I'm going to do it. So inside of our main blueprint function, I'm going to create a new property called this.errors. And for now, I'm just going to set it equal to an empty array. Okay. Now back in this prototype function, let's create an if statement. Okay. And then in here, let's say that if this dot data is equal to an empty string, then we want to push a string inside of our errors array. So let's say this dot errors. If I can spell errors, that'd be brilliant. Okay, this dot errors dot push. And remember, push is an array method in JavaScript. And here, let's create a new string and say, please enter the name of the city. Excellent. Now, one last thing we want to do is make this file available to our controller. So right here in the end, let me just format that. So there we go. Okay, so right here, let's say module.exports and then set it equal to our weather model. Okay, perfect. So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is this.data property. I mean, what is this? What is going to be its value? So check this out. Let's go back to our controller, and in here, let's create a new constant called weather. And remember, it's the weather with a capital W, okay? So const weather, and then first of all, let's require in our weather model. So I think the path is // and then model and then weather. Perfect. And now inside of this get weather function, let's create a new variable. Okay, well, a new constant. So let's call it weather. So const, and this is going to be a lowercase w weather. So const weather. Okay, and then set it equal to an instance of our weather model. So to do that, we need to say new weather. Okay, and since it's a function, it takes one argument. So if we go back to weather.js file, we can see that it takes one argument, which is data. Now, obviously, if we are initiating this function here, we need to pass in an argument. Now, what could the argument be? Well, it's going to be the name of the city that the user is going to type in. So in other words, it's going to be the input value. And remember, the value of the input is request.body dot city. Excellent. After that, let's call in our data validation method, the one that we made here. Okay, so weather.prototype is validate user input. So let's go ahead and copy it, and right here, let's say weather dot, and then it's the validate user input, and let's call in this method. Okay. Now let's create a new if statement and check for any errors. So to begin with, our errors array, this one right there, it's empty, meaning there are no errors. However, if there are any errors, then the length of the array will be greater than 0, right? So let's say that if this, so in here, come on, let's create a new if statement, okay, and say if weather dot errors dot length. Okay, now this is checking that if this evaluates to true. So true is obviously not 0 in JavaScript or any programming language. So 0 is a falsy value, and anything greater than 0 is a truthy value. So if the length of the weather, if this errors array is greater than 0, then this condition is going to be true. So in this case, what we're doing is we're checking that if the length of the errors array is greater than 0, then what we want to do is we still want to render our index.hbs page. So res.render, and in here, let's say index, but then we also want to create a new object and give it a property called error. Okay, now inside of this error property, we are going to set it to equal weather dot errors. And now to actually put the error out, we can use a built-in JavaScript method called toString. Perfect. Now after this if block, let's create an else block. So after this curly brace, let's say else, and then cut our Axios get request. So from there, Axios, the word Axios, all the way to this closing parentheses. Okay, let's cut this out and then paste it right here. Perfect. So this code will only run if the first condition is not true, meaning we are not going to make an API call unless there are no errors in our errors array. Okay. Now one last thing we need to do is render this error property in our index.hbs file. So let's open up our view, and below this weather, let's open up 2 new pairs of curly braces, and in here we can type error. Excellent. Okay, so now it's time to test things out. So let's go back to the terminal, terminate the current process, and then restart it. Now refresh in the browser. First of all, let's try to get the weather for a new city. Let's say Prague. Okay, press go, and we are getting the Prague error. The Prague weather, which is -1.46. Now let's see what happens when we press go without typing anything in this input field. Press go, and we get the error. Please enter the name of the city. This is perfect. Right, so our application is now complete for the most part. Now let's make a few changes to make it better. First of all, let's go ahead and try to make these 2 buttons work. I feel bad for them because we've been working on this application for over an hour and we didn't even talk about those buttons. I feel really bad for them. Let's just take a moment of silence. Okay, so now let's give them a bit of attention. So let's head back to our code editor, and in here, let's open up our views. And in my case, I already have my index.hbs file open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the navbar, because that is where those buttons live. And here in this anchor tag, the first one is the home. So here, to direct it to home, all we need to do is pass in the href or / because that is the base URL. And now we have another button, an anchor tag for the about button. So we need to, inside of this href, we need to say / about. I need to breathe. Okay. So now let's go ahead and do the same for the about.hbs page. So here, let's give this the href or / and this the href of / /about. Excellent. So another thing that we can do to make our code a bit more scalable is go to our controller, okay, and then we can use the JavaScript object destructuring method to extract out these temperature and the city properties. So inside of this Axios request, let's create a new constant, okay, and now to use the destructuring, we use the curly braces. And now what exactly do we want to extract? So we want to extract this temp property out of this response.data.main, and then this name property out of this response.data. So within this curly braces, let's say temp and set it to equal response.data.main. Okay. We can even go one step further and give this temp property our own preferred name. So to set a new name, we use a colon, just like that. And I'm going to call it temperature. Okay. Oh, that's not right. Temperature. Okay. Now let's go ahead and copy this line, paste it below. And here we need to do the same for the name of the city. So here, the name of the property is city, but the name, but my preferred name is location. Okay. And now here we can get rid of this .main because we're just extracting out this property from response.data. Okay, so now we can use our own preferred names instead of these properties that we have there. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this temperature property and paste it in place of that. And let's copy the location and paste it in place of that. And look how much more cleaner this is. This is a lot more nice to look at. Okay, so now press save and it's time to test things out in the web browser. So let's go to the terminal and kill the current process, restart it, refresh in the web browser. And first of all, let's try to get the weather of a city. So let's say we want to get the weather for Manchester. So there's the weather for Manchester, which is very cold at the moment. And let's try to submit this form without typing any values. So press go and we get the error message. Perfect. And let's not forget about these two buttons up there. So let's press about and we get taken to the about page. And now if I press home, we get taken back to the home page. Excellent. Okay, so now with everything in place, our project is complete. We have covered a lot of ground in a very short span of time. We've learned about Express, handlebars, routing, HTTP requests, API, and the MVC pattern. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you did, please show me some love by dropping me a like, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.